Welcome back, everybody, to the Growing Band Director podcast. Very excited to have Fred Ford along with us today. But before we get going, I'd like to just do a quick shout out to two new Patreon members that we have, to Lauren and to Yumi. Thank you guys for joining the show and contributing every month. We really appreciate that. We're upwards of 12,000 views now. We're getting up there, and I think all the hard work is paying off. So just wanted to mention we have had a couple episodes released recently that are audio only, but they are repertoire lists from 0.5 or beginning band all the way up through grade 4. So go back and check some of those out if you haven't. And then also coming up here in the next week or so, we're going to release 3 different episodes of Jeff and I, some of our favorite holiday music for band. So that's going to be coming up if you want any interesting things with that. But now we're going to be on to this show, which we're going to entitle All Things Percussion with Fred Ford. Fred, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you very much, Pat.
Very good. Thank you for being here very much. I would like to start with a little bit about you. Would you give us your backstory for the listeners who don't know you?
Sure. I didn't march in drum corps, or actually high school band for that matter. I grew up in a CYO band in Revere, Massachusetts, St. Anthony's Band, which was a summer competing band, just like drum corps, just like actually there really was no organized competitive high school band when I was younger. And we competed throughout Massachusetts, the occasional show in New Hampshire. And St. Anthony's Band was an extremely progressive, forward-thinking band. George Zingali, later of 27 Lancer and Cadet and Star of Indiana fame, was a clarinet player my first year. My second year became the drill designer. Mark Sylvester, Wanda Conway, many people in the activity started with me in St. Anthony's. And I was there from when I joined at age 9 until I started teaching, which was somewhere when I was like 19 or 20. And I became involved with the early stages of NESBA, teaching at Gloucester High School in Somerville, Mass. And then took a few years off to graduate college and get married. Then came back through a chance encounter with the person who was then running St. Anthony's Band, which mutated into a drum corps, Star of Revere. Small Eastern Mass, CYO, and ultimately DCI, Division III drum corps. And I was the drum instructor for a few years and the arranger. The brass caption head was a guy named Jim Buckley, who is a very famous percussionist here in Massachusetts. Jim is kind of percussion royalty, actually. He taught the early 27th Lancers lines, marched in the Boston Crusaders in the 60s, won VFW, or American Legion Individuals Championships, studied, for any percussionist that would know this, with George Lawrence Stone, and Jim has an original version of the manual stick control, which is kind of like the Bible for beginning percussionists.
Yep.
So Jim was the horn guy, which was very intimidating for me because he knew more about drums than I did, but it was a great experience. I taught there for 3 years. When that organization folded up, became involved with another corps called the Buccaneers from Lowell, Mass. And I was doing all the arranging and teaching kind of by myself, maybe 1 or 2 helpers here and there. And then in 1994, I was approached by the East Coast Jazz to be the staff and program coordinator and work with the overall big picture of things, which I did from 94 until 2006, and was very proud of the work that myself and a lot of people did with that organization. We won 2 DCI championships in 1998, 2004 in the open class. Mm-hmm. And more importantly, impacted an awful lot of students' lives to go on to become professional educators, performers. Adam Rappa, one of the premier trumpet players in the country, and they went on to have great success with Blast, started in the East Coast Jazz. So
I have a good friend who marched in those corps, Tom LaPointe.
Yes.
Yeah, he was impacted very much.
He literally. Yep. Tom was twice the size when he marched, and now he's a fraction of that. Yeah, yep. Good kid, great student, good drummer.
Yep.
So I did that, and then while I was teaching, around 1990, Jim strongly recommended to me that I start doing some judging to get a sense of the other side of the activity. I did, and enjoyed it very much. And then because I was heavily involved in the summer with drum corps, I started just judging high school marching band. And then when the winter percussion activity grew, started becoming involved in that also. And I started off just judging in NESBA, and then MICA, Massachusetts Instrumental Conductors, Choral Conductors Association,
Yep.
started judging for them also in percussion and the music caption. Um, Expanded my way north to Maine, south to Connecticut, where I met Mr. Smith. And in the last 15 years or so, I've been judging music and percussion in Indiana. What that always bothers me that I say music and percussion. But those are the captions the way they're described.
Oh.
Indiana, down south a lot. And then in the summer, I judge for Drum Corps Associates. So I've been very active in the adjudication process. I stopped. I was involved with the Jersey Surf Drum and Bugle Corps after the East Coast Jazz folded for a number of years. I helped out with the Spartans up in Nashua, New Hampshire for a few. And for 1 year, when my daughter marched, it was kind of cool. I was involved with the citations of Burlington, Mass. At this point, I just strictly judge, and it keeps me very busy. So that's how I got to here.
So Jeff, would you speak to the people a little bit about why it's so great that we have Fred on? What are things that you know about Fred? Why is his knowledge so important to our field?
Fred and I have judged together for a long time, and Fred judges for me in Connecticut for the Musical Arts Conference for Winter Percussion. The thing that Fred brings to the table is the ability to judge music and percussion. Though his primary is percussion, he is a great music judge and understands the function of how music and percussion must interrelate. And he understands how music has to be brought forward, and when it's brought forward, staged in a particular manner, not necessarily in the visual concept, but in the written concept, so that the right parts come forward at the right time. And the nice thing about Fred is that he's not afraid to tell a band director that, you're doing a nice job, but you need to fix this, and this. Whereas some other judges aren't willing to say that. And the nice thing about Fred is that when he says you should think about fixing a sort of things, he tells them how he would fix them.
Out of it, yeah.
And he'd say, honestly, go and ask other people too, but he'd at least give a way of fixing a problem, which is very good in the judging community, especially for our younger band directors who are just joining the activity, on knowing what they can do to improve upon their product.
And the solutions-based stuff is really important, right? If you give band directors solutions, I know not every band director takes it well, but they should, right? Especially if you give them solutions.
Well, I think the solution part is the most important part, and being able to find through listening what needs to be fixed. That's his real strong point. He does that well, and he's worked with some pretty fabulous people, like you said before, George Singali, Mark Sylvester, when he's talking about, now these are all visual guys, but yet understood music like was the back of their hand all the time, because they wrote to the music, and Fred does that well. So I got a question for Fred.
Sure.
Matched grip or traditional grip, and why?
I started out as a traditional grip player for obvious reasons. The drum was on my leg with a leg rest and a strap, and tipped to an angle. Somewhere around quite a while, 5 or 6 years into playing, we decided that if we took the drum, the sling, split it up in half, put one clip on and put the other clip on one of the tension rods, the drum would be flat. It still hurt you. It still whacked into your knees and your shins, but at least it was flat. And from that point on, traditional grip has become a vanity at best. I'm used to it because that's just the way my muscles developed. Although when I play drum set, which I do a lot, I tend to go back and forth between matched and traditional. When teaching, if there's a snare line or performers that are capable of playing traditional grip, I'll defer to that because they want to, because that's what they see when they watch videos of world-class drum corps and indoor percussion lines. Theoretically, it makes no sense whatsoever. I think Jeff's screen is frozen. Okay.
Is
Um,
is there a, I mean, you say you do it if the kids want to do it and the kids can handle it. Is there a way to know? Because those, there's those drumline teachers who say, well, my kids really want to, but I don't know if they're ready to do it yet. Like how do you know when that place is?
it's developing a different skill set with the left hand, the muscles. And if they have the ability to play, I'm trying to simulate a match grip left
Yeah.
hand here. If they have the ability to be dexterous in both hands to do what is required, typically it's just so much easier. And from an educational standpoint, everybody starts off the same way. They should start all off with match grip,
Mm-hmm.
because you never know where you're going to wind up, what instrument you're playing. So, Jeff, were you going to say something?
Well, I agree with you. I always taught match grip.
Yeah.
And because it allowed my tenor players, my bass drum players, in contraband, my timpani players, my timbali players, to just go back and forth with ease from one instrument to the next without any problem. And then I came across, as you said, Kyle, a group, and Fred said, a group of kids that just said, hey, we just saw so-and-so. We want to play traditional next year. And one of my instructors, Bernie Molesky, was very much into a traditional grip. And he said, let's do traditional grip. And I said, okay, but I can't afford to angle the drum with the special harness. It's going to have to remain the flat harness.
Mm-hmm.
And they did that. And then when I retired, Chris Rivera came on at my former school at Norwalk High School, and he's very much a match grip person and switched everything back to match grip, and they've stayed that way since. Does it change your judging when you see somebody play matched or traditional?
No.
Okay.
Do I mean, that you're asking a bigger question, which is what of my personal biases or interests or likes can I leave at the door when I start to judge? That's really difficult sometimes, but that's the first one that I have to drop the second I sit down in front of a percussion group.
But don't you find that if you've got a hot mess in front of you,
mm-hmm.
and you're seeing traditional grip, that you might go into critique and say, you've got a lot of muscle teaching to go on to get that traditional grip going properly. Would you ever think about going to match grip?
If you can identify clearly that the left hand is the issue, then yes.
Yeah.
But if they're just a hot mess because they're a hot mess because they can't play, I'm going to start with a much more basic discussion with the instructor at that point. But yeah, I mean, at the scholastic level, especially in the marching band or scholastic A level for indoor percussion, you don't see a lot of traditional grip really.
No, not anymore.
It's primarily match grip, and that makes all the sense in the world. If I'm judging an open or a world group and they're still playing, they're playing match grip, quality of sound is quality of sound.
Right.
Uniformity of technique, approach to the instrument. If it's similar, I don't care if you're playing with two left hands like this. If it works, it works.
Yeah, there you go. So I'm going to give you a hypothetical question.
Sure.
You have 7 students in your battery.
Mm-hmm.
How would you voice them? What instruments would you have them play? How would you voice them? Because I think a lot of our listeners are faced with the fact that they have a limited number of kids coming in post-COVID, and they're concerned about how to voice their battery on the field.
So we're assuming that there are also kids in a front ensemble.
Yep.
We'll assume that for the moment, yes.
Okay. And then talent level would tend to dictate a little bit of that. One trick I learned early on I learned a lot from watching other groups and competitors and everything else, is if there's one outstanding player and everybody else is at a secondary level, make that person the single multi-tenor drummer, because they can do more unencumbered by anybody else in their section. So if you have 7, one is a really good player, you might have 2 snares, 1 tenor, and 4 bass drums, just so you have a broad range of tonality with the bass drums. Mm-hmm. If it's the other way around and you've got a couple or 3 good kids that are all the same talent level, actually I probably would tend to stick with that 2-1-4 combination as much as possible. 1 snare sounds awful thin, and it gets brittle sounding. The combination of 2 musicians makes a world of difference. Not with the tenor drums as much, especially when you can use multiple kinds of beater on the head. You can use a rubber mallet, you can use a softer mallet or a felt, and then the hard ones to project.
Mhm.
And anything less than 4 bass drums, it's a bit of a challenge.
Could I back up and ask a bigger picture music education question?
Sure.
I view that marching percussion, front ensemble percussion, marching band percussion in general is a big part of percussion education. And I know that there are some schools who don't do it, right? So what would be your I know I didn't prepare you for this question, but
Okay.
so what are the biggest things that the marching activity in general for percussion brings to the education of a percussionist?
Well, just the simultaneous responsibility. These kids have to learn simultaneous responsibility to march in place at the same time. And it's what I grew up with. And yes, we also had a concert element to St. Anthony's band in my entire education. And then as I got older and got involved in drum set drumming and everything else, there's something unique about marching with the drum on. Um, Keeping time with your feet and playing in time at the same time is an extremely challenging task for any young musician. And that challenge, and we saw, especially starting in the 80s when um, membership declined considerably, and then we see the advent of really pitted percussion ensembles, which were able to achieve a lot of great things musically. The big difference is, especially in marching band, if you have a battery, and the battery can be staged behind the wind ensemble, and they're providing pulse, then you're in an optimal situation for ensemble clarity
Yeah.
in terms of pulse control. Once you've got a pitted percussion ensemble, wherever they are, the winds need to listen to them. Sometimes I've even seen groups with the front ensemble only, and the winds really can't relate to that. The percussionists have to listen back. That's a challenge and a half.
Yeah.
But to me, that the biggest thing that marching percussion brings to music education is the ability to provide, and that's what the ultimate responsibility of a drummer was, going back to the advent of rudimental percussion and keeping time for the troops militarily,
Mm-hmm.
is to march them, keep them in time. Let's go back to that, and that's what the start of it is for marching percussion too.
So
Did that answer your question?
Yes, very much. Thank you. You just mentioned the front ensemble. Would you sort of give us some, what are the basic instruments that we really need to have a full sound for the front ensemble? Sort of what's a minimum number of students, maybe, right, to do a good job? And that might be a bigger question as to how do you know when to split or not split, or
Yep.
what do you basic needs, things like that.
The flippant answer would be one really good synthesizer. But in terms of instrumentation, currently the way that we do things in the activity, there are 4 acoustic keyboards that are used primarily: the marimba voice, vibraphone, xylophone, and orchestra bells or glockenspiel. You don't need to have 4 performers though, because ideally the xylophone and orchestra bells are used a little more judiciously and
Yep.
only for specific moments, but at least 2, with the opportunity for the marimba player and the vibe to be able to access those other pieces of equipment. Or if you have multiple players, great, multiple instruments, you can voice things harmonically in a creative way. At least one auxiliary player that can handle cymbal crashes, concert bass drum support, gong, anything like that that's going to give you a more orchestral nature. A timpanist, it's a 50-50 proposition, right? I don't see a lot of marching timpani.
Yeah, we don't march
In
timpani
marching
anymore.
band. No, we don't march them, thank God.
Oh.
We don't even hit them anymore, because when schools go out and spend tens of thousands of dollars on timpani for a concert band, the last thing you want to do is drag them outside in a football field. And also, due to the nature of a lot of the pieces that are being performed nowadays, it's a little less symphonic or orchestral,
Yep.
more all over the place. And then obviously the electronic component to it, which is kind of huge right now. Not just a synthesizer, but bass guitar, electric guitar, voice if necessary for the show. And that's opened up a whole new world, not just for people in my world as a judge, but for the performers too.
Right. As somebody who's heard a lot of groups and judges a lot of groups and has worked with a lot of groups, we're talking about front ensemble for a moment. Can you maybe talk to us a little bit about good habits in the writing for front ensemble? Like, What are things that work well, and what are some things front ensemble writers probably shouldn't do if you had your way?
Sure. Early on, when we introduced, just in the 60s or early 70s, the first marching keyboards, a xylophone and orchestra bells. And then until really the early 80s, when they became grounded equipment, um, it was really just an outgrowth of the wind score, that they would double some of the melodic line or the secondary line, and we're using mallets that were wholly inappropriate, and it was a piercing sound. And then throughout the 80s, things developed considerably. They became their own voice, the keyboards in particular. And now you see in a typical drum corps setting or a large marching band setting, multiple vibes, multiple marimba, and the occasional xylophone and orchestra bells. From an orchestration standpoint, I think the first and foremost thing is, what voice do you want them to have in the big picture ensemble? Are they can quite frequently, and especially nowadays, since we've seen the advent of indoor percussion, they take the focus a lot of the time melodically. Do they provide harmonic support to what's happening throughout any voice in the winds? We saw early on with the introduction of synths and bass guitars, the ability to support or even replace the low end of the tuba or contrabass voice, or low brass in particular. That's a tricky one, because once you're doing that, or if it's augmenting it, you don't really want to get that synthesized sound. You just want to feel the extra oomph from the low end without dominating. It should still be about the performer on the field, how they can communicate sound from the wind. So a lot of these things, the great thing about percussionists is that we're not stuck in our ways at all. And we've seen evolution constant. It's more like a revolution. It's constant. We're ever evolving in the percussion world. Orchestration has been a big thing of that. One of the problems I see with smaller bands, it's getting better if they're buying a chart from a website or from an arranger outside of whatever. And it used to be that the orchestra bells and the xylophone would just double the piccolo and clarinet parts.
Oh.
That was painful.
Oh.
First of all, and especially when I would head to Maine and I would judge the Maine finals, and there could be snow on the ground.
Yep.
So intonation is a very relative thing at that point. And the last thing you want to do is call attention to what the piccolo is trying to struggle to do, and hitting a metallic instrument to match that timbre or pitch doesn't happen.
So you're saying if a band director lives in the cold weather, they shouldn't double a lot of stuff from the front to the back?
Wholeheartedly. And well, I mean, pitch goes out the window when the weather drops considerably, even from when you took the equipment off the truck to get to the field. However much time later, you're dealing with a variable you can't control at that point. So trying to find a unique or individual voice for the keyboards in the overall musical ensemble is very important. And then through the use of sound reinforcement, and I don't mean synthesizers or bass guitar, but microphones that reinforce the sound of the acoustic keyboards, getting an appropriate blend there, because there's nothing worse than a really, really hot mic picking up keyboards and drowning out the wind ensemble. Or if you don't, and you have a large wind ensemble and you're not supporting it at all, we lose the acoustic keyboards, or worse, the performers are now whacking away on a rosewood marimba, trying to project wrong. It's the wrong approach to the instrument. It's doing damage to the instrument, and you're not going to hear it appropriately.
Jeff, what do you think some of the pros and the cons of front ensemble audio are?
I'll start with cons. Cheap microphones and a weak mixer, and not having the ability to mix from a distance. A lot of people now are getting it so that they can mix from their iPad sitting in the stands, because every scenario you play it, it's a different set of circumstances. You need to mix it. And just like Fred said, you need to get a good blend and balance. Sometimes you get to some shows and those mics are so loud, you can't even hear the horns because they've mixed it up so high. On the positive side, from a teacher standpoint, the thing that I love about front ensemble is it teaches so many different techniques. How to play a tambourine correctly, how to play a triangle correctly, how to play claves correctly, how to play any kind of hand-struck instrument, uh, uh, and then utilization of instruments like crotales in relationship to the orchestra bells, and the electronics enhance that. But I very much appreciate the fact when the electronics don't overpower the real keyboard instruments, so that the kids learn to develop techniques, and the development of two mallet techniques being taught properly. I'm sure Fred could talk about this for hours, about how he's watched people use two mallets, and he's watched them said, well, that's not exactly how you hold those mallets when you play two mallet percussion or four mallet percussion. And teaching the kids to listen back rather than listening to the drum major. I think that's a big thing. How many times, Fred, have you and I judged and we've watched the front ensemble going with the drum major's hands, and we're out of time like crazy?
Yeah.
It's come back and gotten us like crazy. I think front ensembles are crucial. I look back to the days of Tarpon Springs when Tarp didn't put a battery on the field, but they did everything with the front ensemble. And the front ensemble, maybe you had 30 kids in it, but they weren't on the field on the front; they were in the back, so that the sound did come through. And Kevin staged it so well so that it sounded beautifully, and it was a wonderful mix. So I think a good front ensemble is crucial, and the teaching of them properly is even more crucial to the education of the kids.
I'm curious what both of you think about, can you give a percussion section full credit, like the top score of whatever you can give them? Can they earn that if there is just a front ensemble or just a battery?
Sure. A lot depends on what sheets you're working from and what criteria they're asking you to evaluate. Um, can they be musical? Absolutely. Matter of fact, they more than likely will be more musical by nature. Musical is such a nebulous word sometimes, but can they contribute in a lot of ways to the musicality of the ensemble? Yeah, I mean, if it comes down to are all things being equal, both groups are achieving at the exact same level, which is, I never quite understood why we use that phrase, because it's probably impossible to evaluate. But if all things are equal and both groups are roughly playing at the same level, you have to take into consideration the additional responsibilities of the groups that are marching. They're creating different listening environments. They're handling the feet as well as the hands. Then again, there are challenges to just being a pitted percussion ensemble and their ability to blend into the wind ensemble, and not they can't control the staging at that point. So it's wherever the winds are relative to them. But for the most part, I've never really had to struggle with Group A marched, Group B didn't, who was better and why. The performance kind of dictates that for me.
Right, and you said it earlier in the discussion, simultaneous responsibility. Sometimes that will be the point that will break the decision of what number to give. But when you're listening and you're judging music performance, music ensemble, whatever the sheets you're using, what you hear is what you judge.
Correct.
And if you can't hear it, and you can't judge it.
So I think, Jeff, we did skip one of the questions we wanted to ask Fred. We got into the front ensemble thing. Can we circle back to the battery part of things? And could you give us some best tips and best techniques that the best writers use, those sort of things to do and things to avoid as a battery writer?
Sure. First and foremost, before we even get into the literature of what they're playing, if the feet don't move in time, everything is a challenge. Everything. So the most important thing, and we've seen most marching bands and drum corps right now, the best marching group section of the band is the drum line, the battery, because these kids are marching year round now because of indoor percussion. They have a dance background. They understand choreography better now. So if the feet move in time, their ability to play in time is greatly enhanced. From an orchestration standpoint, a little bit like with the front ensemble, you need to define what the role is of the percussion or the battery at any moment in time. Most of it should be supportive in nature, to the winds, to the melody, unless the percussion is the featured segment at the time. Um, and when it's supportive, less is always more. Um, Sometimes a small battery, a 2 1 and 3 or a 2 1 and 2 battery, or even less, can dominate the spectrum sound wise over a moderate sized wind ensemble. Um, so always keep in mind density of scoring opportunities. Try not to have all of your battery playing 2D phrases all the time. Um, Try to incorporate matching up segments. The obvious one is snares to an upper voice, tenors to the middle, bass to the bottom. Get that segmental opportunity going. Create some variety through the orchestration of sounds and textures. And it helps not just the percussion judge, because I'm not just listening to snare, tenor, and bass drum the whole time, but it jumps into that musicality category and starts to support what the winds are doing appropriately. And then when it's a percussive feature and it's a moment for them to shine, whatever you need to do, whatever you can do, whatever bullets are available in your gun to make things happen for the audience and for the musical presentation, fire them. But otherwise, be mindful of being supportive at all times.
So, Fred, I was in a clinic this week for NESBA, hosted by Tom Lazat, and the featured speaker was Tom Onyx. And he was talking about how he'll go and be judged, Dartmouth High School specifically, he'd go and be judged by a music judge, and they'd say nothing about percussion. And then he'd have a music judge who was a percussionist, and they'd just say a little bit about percussion. So as a person who is a primary percussionist, but a superb music judge, how do you approach judging the caption of music performance or music ensemble and get all the entities in there and making sure you address the percussion section?
Sampling is key to any adjudication responsibility that you have. If you're looking at marching, visual, color guard, percussion, winds, whatever it is, you need to sample all the elements. The amount that you sample them, the amount of weight you place on their success is really relative to the amount of times that the group is telling you that they're important, meaning they're the featured section. Not to say that you should ever ignore any one section completely. I don't care if it's, and I've seen percussion ensembles that are 2 kids in the pit, one playing a suspended cymbal and a snare drum, one playing a mounted bass drum, and I'm the music effect judge. I still try to find a way to keep in mind that my tape, my recording, should be able to be used as an educational tool for the band director or the percussion instructor. So if they're going to play my recording for the students, I better have something to say to all those students. If it's a more advanced, or in the case of Dartmouth, exceptionally advanced percussion ensemble, I find it relatively easy because they make that the featured voice for a large, but not all of, but for a large percentage of the show. They bring it to let it come to me, which is really how I was taught to judge effect, period. Let it come to you. And if it doesn't, figure out why and offer some suggestions. Don't try to rewrite somebody's show. Just offer some suggestions to make their program more effective to the audience, not necessarily to me, a judge, but to the audience. Dartmouth does that very, very well. I do know, and this is going back about 20 years now, especially in drum corps, and then band was actually the precursor of that. We started to combine the music captions and say that it's overall music ensemble. And when a percussionist or a person who had a percussion background was judging that caption, they would almost shy away from talking about the percussion because they felt like they're obligated to talk more about the winds. But not if that's not where the success or the issues are in a program. Similarly, I think I've seen, and I've been on the end of this as an instructor also, the judge has a wind background and a limited percussion background, and they, especially if it's a percussion feature and they're not talking, they're doing something wrong. I don't want to name fellow judges, but you have to evaluate what is in front of you at that moment. So I'm sure Tom had some similar thoughts to what I just said. I didn't hear the call, so.
No, he very similar to what you're saying. And the point when I was talking with Tom Lazat afterwards, I said, as a judge, if you're just going to discuss coordination, you're going to sample all those things because they all have to coordinate. So you couldn't miss not talking about percussion or front ensemble. And I think that's a big thing. But I think something you just said is really important, that the music says something to you, so you judge it. And that comes back to the writers, and that comes back to the band director saying, well, when you've written this book, whether it be the band director writing it or an outside person writing the book, where are you taking each part of the ensemble, whether it be wind or percussion, and making it say something to the audience? Mm-hmm. And, you know, that comes back to what you and I were trained with DCA, with the new DCA model, mm-hmm. where how are you entertaining the people in the stands, and not the parents of the kids in that band, but everybody in the stand.
Right.
Because how many times do we get to a show and every parent from said school is sitting right in front of the box and the first 4 rows right behind the box. So all you hear is them screaming while the band's playing and saying, well, if these people would kindly just clap a little quieter so I could hear the band, I'd really appreciate that.
And they have that cowbell that goes ding, 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 ding.
Oh, the cowbell and the towel that starts spinning around over their heads. My God. So I've got a question for you.
Sure.
What do you see as the area that many small band directors overlook when you're judging marching band?
What am I judging? What caption?
Music.
So I'm looking at an overall perspective. I try to keep in mind at all times what the resources and the restraints are on any given program. So I'm not expecting a Broadway production from every group, though I tend to get it from some of them. I think that they sometimes get caught up in the weeds of these kids have to play together and in time, and that makes perfect sense. That's the imperative responsibility. But keeping the audience in mind at times, a group that will play a deeply academic piece that doesn't necessarily speak to the greater audience, I don't know that that's appropriate sometimes. Similarly, some of these pop tunes that they're trying to employ nowadays don't translate well to instrumental music at all. The kids might get excited, and that's a great thing, when they hear we're going to play a Ariana Grande song, for example. Now, if it's a ballad, it might work because of the legato nature of the melody. But if it's an up-tempo piece, it's probably not going to translate as well as you would like it to. So always keep in mind there are people that are watching the show that are trying to react impartially, unless they're parents of the students. And that's what really I think judges are, is people that are watching the show with a slightly more informed background than the rest of the stands. We should react accordingly. So if you're going 20, 30 seconds without creating an impact or a moment or have little variety, you're losing the engagement of the audience. That, as I've seen as an effect music judge, is a big issue at times. So typically, if the audience isn't engaged, more than likely the performers are not either. And that becomes an issue with their ability to communicate thoughts and communicate energy and ideas that are written. So to me, that would be the biggest issue.
Well, that goes back to something that you said earlier. You said that when you were a youngster, you worked with this gentleman by the name of George Zingali, marched with this gentleman, Mark Sylvester, and both of them have the 20-second rule in anything that they write. That something impactful has to happen every 20 seconds or you're going to lose your audience.
Yeah, and I believe Joe Morella, the drum guy who came to Massachusetts from, well, Blue Rock originally, but from the Mid-Atlantic area, was the master of what's going to happen and when and why, and looking at effect. And through Joe, I've learned a lot of that stuff too.
Yeah, that's important.
And one last note on that too. In selecting, and I'm sure Tom talked about this, Tom Lazard, before, but in selecting material for your marching band or any musical ensemble, the kids have to be excited about it. They have to understand it and relate to it. Drummers tend to be less concerned about what the music is and how many notes they get to play. That's their real focus. That isn't always a good thing sometimes. As a matter of fact, it can be a bad thing sometimes, but it's easy to get drummers excited because they get to put drums on. that should be enough.
So for anybody who just real quick, anybody who doesn't know, Fred's referring to what last episode, I think it was 35, where we had Tom Lazat on. And anybody who is enjoying this one with Fred should go back and check out that one if you haven't heard it. He was great. So thank you for quoting him.
No problem.
I have a pet peeve question, but Jeff, I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, go ahead with your pet peeve, please.
So I want to hear what was at least one of Fred's pet peeves when it comes to either marching band / marching band percussion, anything marching arts related. What are some pet peeves?
I have two, and
Okay.
they're very strong. The
I'm gonna
first
write
one
them
is a
down.
real simple one. You have these students in the front ensemble playing in front on equipment, marimbas, vibes, whatever it may be, that costs some money. And these kids are, in some cases, extremely skilled musicians. Please, please, please do not set up the drum major's podium 1 foot in front of them so that we see staging or slabs of wood so I can't see the performers. Sometimes I even have a hard time hearing them, especially if they're not reinforced with sound. I get it. You want the drum major to be as close to the members on the field as possible, but give these kids an opportunity to have some space around them so the sound can project.
Do you have since you're on that pet peeve, we've had everything from them on the back hash to them on the right, to them on the left, to them in the middle, and all that. Do you have some common, just do what works for your show sort of deal?
Typically, what works for your resources. If it's only a pitted percussion ensemble, assuming that you have the resources to amplify the keyboard sound, reinforce the keyboard sound, put them as far back as possible wherever you would typically stage a battery. If you want to do it to the side, right or to the left, that's okay, as long as it's far enough back, or if the drill design takes the wind ensemble around that percussion group. But and then when it's the battery, typically you want to keep them up front. It just allows for separation of sound too.
Okay. Pet peeve number 2.
This is again percussion related, but it's to the battery. Unison bass drum orchestration. If it's not at the end of a production, or at worst at the end of a phrase, it's too much. Mm-hmm. 2 bass drummers can wipe out an entire band when playing the same thing at the same time. The density of that sound it distorts the weight in the musical ensemble. It calls my attention right to it, and it sounds thick. More than likely, it's not going to be as together as you would like either. Save those moments for enders of phrases, ideally ends of productions. Mm-hmm. Something that and similarly, the use of concert bass drums at times too.
Jeff, I have one final question, but I'm sure you have more than that. I have just one question that I wrote down that I want to ask him, but I want to give you the floor.
You want me to? All right. So what are your typical suggestions and a critique for a band director to improve his percussion ensemble, whether it be the front ensemble or battery or both?
If it's a battery, at all times, they either need to learn the drill better, understand their responsibilities visually, starts and stops, and everything like that. And if they have at least gotten to the point where that's okay, I suggest they track it as much as possible. Tracking meaning put the battery in a group. If you can put the winds with them and march around the track on the outside of the football field, almost in parade formation, that cures a number of ills from a pulse perspective. Do it with the starts and stops that are in the drill too, if you can. But that, especially, that's a September comment. That's an early October comment. In some cases, a late October comment. But it always, and I learned this from when I worked with Charlie Poole in drum corps at the East Coast Jazz, that drum line would track 90% of their rehearsal time. If it was a visual rehearsal, if it was a sectional, they warmed up by tracking. Yeah. So that's a huge success point for me to bring up and critique. And then if there's a pit and does the percussion ensemble rehearse by itself on the football field? That's another question I always ask. Mm-hmm. Because the pit, can they always hear the battery or the winds in between, and they struggle sometimes to hear pulse? So if you can run a few rehearsals whenever possible with just percussion on the field, on a football field, it should do a lot to improve ensemble timing, balance, and blend of the percussion.
I know one thing that really perturbs me is I'm judging. I've got the winds characterizing the show. I've got the battery characterizing the show. And then I've got the front ensemble, great musicians,
Standing
playing
still
their
and
heart
busy.
out. And it's like looking at white bread the whole time. It's just sitting there, no facial expression, no communication of the show. They're just into it. How does that affect you?
I will comment on that inevitably in almost a lighthearted manner and say to the front ensemble, listen backfield, listen to the emotion that's coming out of the program right now, serious, lighthearted, whatever it may be. Try to communicate that because you're doing it and you're playing, but it helps to see the visualization of that through choreography. And quite often, I've had the color guard person or somebody in the visual team work with the front ensemble. Even if it's just one rehearsal, an hour at times, to get them used to being more expressive with their body. We don't get involved in that as instructors. Sometimes percussion instructors, we're too worried about the hands or the hands and the feet. Let's get the rest of the body going sometimes.
Yep.
And it tends to actually enhance the mood or the performance of what they're doing musically too. So I don't shy away from bringing that up, but I bring it up in a you can do even more by doing this kind of comment.
Thank you, Kyle.
So Fred, you've clearly been around many master teachers
Yes.
in your life, right? Are there any common threads that you can point out that maybe has helped people on the teaching side of things really be effective teachers that might affect people who are not even percussion teachers at this point, right? But just teachers in general?
Sure. And we can start with George Zingali. And the first percussion instructor I had, a guy named Mark DePerry, actually his dad, Charlie, before that, in St. Anthony's Band, leading through to people that I then worked with, like Jim Buckley, Charlie Poole, Jeff Bolduc, and a lot of visual people also. Understand at all times that you're talking to a student, and in most cases, it's a student that's not going to become you, an instructor. But this may be a 1, 2, 3, or even 5-year part of their life. Try at all possible to convey your passion for this, for what we do, to them, that hopefully they will want to make it part of their lives also. If you can do that, and that's when they quote unquote, you've won that student over. Then you have them. Then they're listening to you for all the right reasons, not because they have to or they're supposed to. They understand the information you're giving them is going to make them better. It's important to them because they want to be better at that point. That's the biggest hurdle to me in teaching, and that I saw from an early age some very good people do. Somebody won me over in year one. I was only 9 years old, so it worked. Actually, I can tell you who it was. It was a guy named Gary Kovitz. My first year, I was in a drum corps, the IC Reveries, before St. Anthony's Band. I was 8. Passed out, we had a beginner class in some corner room of a hall. He passed out drumsticks. We got a lesson for an hour. At the end of rehearsal, he said, all right, give me the sticks back. Come back next week and you'll get them again. And I was chomping at the bit, as were my fellow beginners. And sure enough, of course, I came back next week. I was dying to get those sticks again. And it's funny, I ran into Gary. I talked to Gary every once in a while. He was very successful with the 27 Lancers and teaching and marching. And I brought that up to him, and he said, well, we probably didn't have the sticks to give away at that point. But I've taught an awful lot of kids to get a drum set when they're like 10 years old. And they're spoiled right off the bat. And I worked for years to become a better drummer because somebody sold me on the value of being a good drummer through emotion, really. So, yeah, it's to communicating the passion that you have as a teacher or performer to a student.
I heard Dr. Tim one time in something I was in, he had that famous thing that I'm sure a lot of people heard, but I'm saying this again in case people have not heard this, and I've used this on the show before, that, oops, my camera just fell. Hold on. Take it away, somebody else.
Well, it's interesting. You're talking about all these people that influenced you and got you to where you are today. Now, if I recall correctly, aren't you still actively playing with a small band?
Not that small. We're 9-piece
soul. 9-piece now.
Yeah. It's guys my age. The original horn section, when we put it together, we're all drum corps guys.
Yeah.
One still is, Joe Taylor, and some are marching band guys that my daughter, who's soon to be 30, there were students that she went to high school with that are the trombone player and the sax player in my band. So yeah, they communicated to me a love, not just for marching band and drum corps, but for percussion and drumming, and it carried over to drum set and everything else. Yeah.
And the neat thing about that is as people have you as a judge, they need to realize they're not talking to somebody who took their instrument and put it in the closet and just became the judge. You're an active performer on your instruments and with fellow instrumentalists on other instruments, and you're performing for people on a regular basis, realizing that the communication to the audience is paramount.
Exactly. And as a drum set drummer in a soul and R&B setting, and I communicate this an awful lot to marching bands, sometimes the most important thing a drum line can do is provide 2 and 4 and just a backbeat, because that's what the music is calling for. And if you're trying to be overly creative or dance around that responsibility, you might be hurting your overall ensemble sometimes. Not that I always want to hear that, but if it's appropriate, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you guys for covering for me. That was a little embarrassing.
No problem.
So I was just going to mention Dr. Tim's quote about students in 15, 20 years won't usually remember what you taught them if they don't go into the field, but they'll remember how you feel, how you made them feel. So I want to point that out again. No matter what idiom we're at as educators, it's really important that the kids remember us for that. I'd like to finally just ask you, Fred, and I'm throwing this on you again. We're entering the fall season. Our first shows are coming up here in the next couple of weeks. Do you have a message to band directors if they were to follow one thing, or as we're entering the season, what's something you might leave us with?
And this is really for New England-based Northeast band programs in particular. We have a short window, maybe 5 weeks, 6 weeks before the weather gets so unpredictable that a rehearsal can take place in 32-degree weather or not. Don't waste a minute in September, especially. And the most successful band programs at their finals were probably very well prepared in September. And on October 1st, probably could do a representative championship level show. If you wait, if you take your time, you're putting a lot of risk and a lot of chance into, hope it doesn't rain next week. Or I hope that, we dealt with the Triple E, the Eastern Equine Encephalitis issue in Massachusetts for a while, or you name it. Or now with the advent of COVID and the breakouts there and everything that bands have gone through, be done as early as possible. If you, as much as you got done at band camp, remember that now and say next year we need to do 10, 20% more at band camp, be more efficient with our time. Because you just never know what's going to happen at the end of the year.
Well, thank you for affirming us, Jeff. Jeff and I, we always try to finish the show at band camp, and at this point, we're a couple of weeks out, but we can get through the show, and now we're working on, weaning from the Met in rehearsal from time to time, and we're starting to talk about performance things too. So
that could be an entire podcast in and of itself. Yeah,
the weaning of the Met. Yes.
Fred, I really appreciate you being on with us. I hope our listeners get a lot from this talk. If anybody wanted to reach out and ask any questions of you, is there a way that you would prefer they do that?
Primarily, if you have my email address and you wanted to present that to whoever had questions, I'd be glad to. Yeah.
Okay. So if anybody wants to email the show at growingbanddirector.com, you are welcome to do that. And we will pass you on to Fred. Jeff, you have a long weekend here. It's Labor Day weekend. What are you going to do with yourself?
Oh, I've got 2 arrangements that I have to write for a friend of mine. And then I have to hire all my judges for Winter Garden, Winter Percussion for the Musical Arts Conference, because I promised them that I'd let them know next week what gigs they have to judge, which you're in there, my friend.
Good.
So, well, thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And Kyle, thank you as well. I really appreciate you talking with us.
This was fun. Thank you, guys.
You're welcome. Everybody, until next time, as Clark Terry would say, keep on keeping on. Welcome, everybody, back to the Growing Band Director podcast. Very excited for today's show, but before we get to that, I just wanted to do a quick shout out. Oh, man, I just kicked my camera. Hold on, we got to stop this.